Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking, and I'm pleased to announce that my guest today is Dr. William Daniel, who is Associate Professor in the School of Canon Law at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., which I believe, Dr. Daniel, is the only School of Canon Law in the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, Dr. Daniel has published many articles in canonical journals and perhaps is best known for the colossal labor of love, which consisted of the compiling and translating and editing of 2 volumes of the case law or jurisprudence of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. These books were entitled Ministerium Justitiae, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But before we get into that, it would be interesting if you could explain to our listeners a little bit about your background and what it was that led you into the world of canon law.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored. I've enjoyed the show so far, so I'm honored to be a guest. I was first exposed to canon law in a very subtle way. I was in the minor seminary, which in other words, for the university level, studying philosophy, and I was just excited about discerning my vocation and listening to and answering the call to holiness. And along the way, there were certain influential people in my life who happened to be canonists, and this was not a major emphasis of theirs in my relationship with them. But, a professor here or a spiritual director there, a director of liturgical music, all kind of their day job in a certain way was as a canonist. So I was just kind of vaguely aware of this. But eventually I would discern that I was not being called to the priesthood, and I knew I wanted to marry my wife of 21 years now, Meredith, and I knew I had to do something to make ends meet for us. So canon law was kind of in the background and occurred to me, and I was encouraged in that, partially because of a love of the Latin language and wanting to use that in a professional way if possible. And it was actually my classics professor who was also a licentiate in canon law, and he said, you could consider canon law as a profession when I was thinking about what to do. And so I did that. And then I went off to Ottawa with my new bride, and that's where I studied canon law and even fell in love with canon law, really wanted to continue through a doctorate, which I was eventually able to do.
What was a doctorate on?
It was on Canon 50. So a general norms doctorate, what authors call the general administrative procedure. And so a just way of issuing any singular administrative act, especially a coercive singular administrative decree or precept. And there's quite a lot of literature on that, especially in Italian and Spanish authors who are generally dissatisfied with Canon 50, which is very brief and has kind of optional language sounding within it. But there's much to explore there in terms of how authorities in the church can proceed in a just manner, in a fair way.
So what did you do after that? When did you complete your doctorate?
Finally, in 2015. So I completed the licentiate in 2006, and it wasn't until 2012 or so that I matriculated in the doctoral program. So in those intervening 9 years or so, I worked in a diocesan tribunal. I was first a defender of the bond, and then a judge, for most of that time a judge, and then also a Vice-Chancellor, which in practice meant a full-time canonist on staff who was there 40 hours a week and could be available to handle or receive any canonical question, and a lot of non-canonical ones too, which then I became very good at directing toward others. So yeah, a great deal of kind of just daily experience of tribunal, especially causes of matrimonial nullity, and also more on that administrative side, assisting with some penal cases, especially graviora delicta and special faculties of the Congregation for the Clergy cases.
So when did your present role begin then at the Catholic University of America?
Upon defending my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation in June 2015, I became qualified to teach in a faculty, ecclesiastical faculty of canon law. And so just 2 months later, even less than 2 months later, my wife and then our 5 children moved to Washington, D.C. So we moved here in August 2015, and very generous of my wife, who homeschools our children and was able to make that a seamless educational experience for them. And this is where we've been for 10 years.
And what kind of people sign up for canon law courses at the CUA? Is it seminarians? Is it diocesan workers? Is it members of religious institutes?
The vast majority of our students are diocesan priests, and probably the vast majority of those are from dioceses in the United States. There are also some religious, men and women religious both, and also some lay people who want, kind of like myself, want to make canon law their profession. Among those lay people, some of them even I'm seeing this trend of some lay people being aware of canon law at a younger age than I was, like as teenagers, for example, and knowing they wanted to be a canonist. And with this background, they go into college or university level studies. They study theology as a way of course, getting a college degree, but also earning the prerequisite studies in order to enter the canon law program. And so we do have some lay students who are freshly graduated from university with a baccalaureate degree or a bachelor's degree, and then join us immediately. So that's another thing that's happening with lay people.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction your many articles and publications on various aspects of canon law, and in particular, the 2-volume collection of decisions of the Apostolic Signatura under the title Ministerium Justitiae. Now, it might be worth explaining what the Apostolic Signatura actually is or does. People may have heard that it's a supreme tribunal in the Church, but they might be a bit confused, as they might also have heard that the Roman Rota is the highest court of appeal in the Church. So a little bit of clarification of the respective roles of these tribunals might be helpful.
Indeed, the Tribunal of the Roman Rota is a kind of supreme court in the Church with regard to causes of matrimonial nullity, which consume the vast majority of time of those who work in diocesan tribunals, and also non-reserved penal causes. It is the court of last appeal in regard to the merits of the case itself, what is decided. But there's this other institution of justice, as we now say with the Apostolic Constitution Praedicate Evangelium, called the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura, which has a kind of a complex series of competencies. So you really can't describe the Signatura without going into each of those 3 areas of competence. One of them that is most familiar to those who work in tribunals is what we call its 3rd section, which is its area of vigilance over all the tribunals of the Church. Every tribunal throughout the world submits an annual report to the Apostolic Signatura explaining its status and its activity, who are the ministers of justice, how many cases it's decided, on what grounds, other statistical details. And then there's this interaction between the Signatura and the tribunals, and there are other disciplinary acts that the Signatura places in that area of its competence. Maybe the more obscure area of competence for the Signatura is its, if you will, judicial competence, which is especially an area of authority over the Roman Rota itself. So parties can put forward complaints, usually of a very technical and procedural nature, against the Roman Rota, and bringing those before the Apostolic Signatura, which then has the competence to judge them with the Pope's vicarious power over one of his other tribunals. And then probably the area of competence of the Signatura that is most frequently in the news, for sure, is its 2nd section. I'm going in weird order here. First, third, first, and now its 2nd section, which is the area in which it judges causes of contentious administrative recourse. In this area, the Supreme Tribunal is essentially judging acts of dicasteries of the Roman Curia. The dicastery, for example, of the clergy, or the dicastery for Institutes of Consecrated Life, Societies of Apostolic Life, and others. Any one of them, actually, even the Secretary of State. And so usually those controversies originate at the local level. For example, if a priest is disciplined by his bishop and the priest feels aggrieved by that decision, he can follow the path of hierarchical recourse to, for example, the dicastery for the clergy. The dicastery of the clergy will issue its ruling in the case, either confirming the bishop's decision or overturning it, or confirming or overturning partially. And either the bishop or the priest in that scenario could find himself aggrieved by the dicastery for the clergy, and therefore we say, make recourse to the apostolic signatura. In essence, it is the introduction of litigation against the dicastery before this supreme tribunal. And so there are a lot of those, like suppression of parishes is another one that is in the news a lot.
Now, it seems that until you took the matter in hand, the decisions of the apostolic signatura were published in a very haphazard and random way in this or that journal from time to time, or they were never published at all. So what was it that led you, and what was it indeed that enabled you, given the difficulty of gaining access to these decisions, to undertake the task of translating them first into English and then compiling them in a systematic way in the 2 volumes?
So I can confirm what you say, that, if you look in the earliest volumes of the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, you do find some decisions of the Signatura, a couple of dozen maybe even, but those all have to do with that first section, cases especially brought against the Rota. It picked up in the late 1960s, 1970s, when Pope St. Paul VI instituted the second section, that administrative section, that I was just describing. And so this was, I think, part of the intention to make these available, but then it did taper off, but came back in very gradually or irregularly in different journals. It was actually my course in Ottawa with the beloved Professor Father Wojciech Kowal, the Oblate of Mary Immaculate, that inspired me to pursue this project. He made a passing reference to a previous professor who had died at a young age, Professor Michel Thériault, a layman, who intended, and in fact had already begun doing a lot of the collecting of decisions of the Apostolic Signatura, intending to translate those into English and have them published with the Gratianus series in Montreal. And I don't know the exact stage of things, but I think this was in the works while he was suffering and then eventually died and was unable to do that. So I was intrigued by this idea because of my interest in Latin. I thought, well, this could be a way I could do something canonical with Latin. So I asked Father Kowal, is that a project that could still be picked up? And he did not see why not. And with the help of a couple other professors, I was able to find and study the work of Professor Thériault, and then eventually approach the Gratianus series with the idea. Gratianus was very supportive. The late Ernest Caparros thought it was a great idea, and so I just started gathering from journals anything from the Apostolic Signatura I could find from 1983 to the present. Then it was about 2005 or 2007, maybe at that point. And I sought the counsel of then Archbishop Raymond Leo Burke, who was Archbishop of St. Louis. And at that point, well, I knew he had a history at the Signatura. He was not yet prefect. And he encouraged me to write to the prefect of the Apostolic Signatura, which was an overwhelming idea, but I thought, well, worst they can say is no, I suppose. So I put together a list of everything I had gathered and had translated and asked if this could be possible. And I was touched by the answer. I was kind of overwhelmed by the response from then Bishop Velasio de Paulis, Secretary of the Apostolic Signatura, saying, you have our full support and you should find more. There are more of our acts published than you have on your list. Find them and gather them and translate. Go for it and just send us everything for review. And then the rest was history. It was a few years before the project was completed, but once it was completed, by then Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke was prefect, and he encouraged immediately a second volume.
Yeah, they're a wonderful contribution, and they are actually beautifully produced by Wilson and Lafleur, who do the Gratianus series. So congratulations on that. And I just wonder, especially for those of us brought up in the common law tradition, I suppose we might find it strange to learn that there's no real system for coordinating these decisions. There's no concept, I suppose, of precedent as we would understand, of binding precedent as we'd understand it in common law. How are lower tribunals expected to be guided by the Apostolic Signatura if these are only sporadically published?
When one reads the decisions, especially the judicial decisions of the Supreme Tribunal and also of the Roman Rota, he should not be looking for novelty. He should be looking for how the law, the legislation is applied reasonably and correctly. And so there's not a dependence on the availability of these decisions in order for us to know what is just, to know what is true and reasonable. The law and, the rational reflection of each jurist and with study can lead us to just decision-making. The decisions of the apostolic tribunals, though, do model for us the just application of the law to particular cases. And they do have authority in the sense of emanating from venerable institutions, but also, at least one would hope, they model for us a secure and rational argument that then can be adopted and applied to one's own particular cases that he's facing. So there's not this dependence on that. We don't look for innovations or novelties in the changes to the law. In fact, neither of these tribunals judges the constitutionality of lower-level laws. That is often the reason why, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States of America has such influence, because it is judging the constitutionality of lower laws and lower court rulings, and therefore directs, in essence, the normative system by a single decision, that this is not at all the dynamic for us.
But it would obviously be much better if there were easier access to these decisions. Has there been any change of approach?
So I'm kind of thinking about both the Rota and the Signatura here. The Roman Rota has begun trying to put forward its decisions in some modern languages as well. I think there was some consideration about whether not even to issue its decisions in Latin anymore, and that has not been accepted, which I think is a very good idea, because the law is in Latin. And Latin is a universal language, unlike any modern language. But they are putting forward translations in the back of the Decisiones volumes in Spanish and English, so to kind of promote a little bit more convenient knowledge of jurisprudence in that way. Both the Roman Rota and the Apostolic Signatura seem to be very generous in making very recent decisions available through canonical journals. They do not have large staffs like most tribunals, and so they don't have full-time staff working on publication of jurisprudence. It's just one among many of their concerns.
That could lead on to another question, because, of course, you're involved also as editor of the Jurist, the prestigious Canon Law journal issued twice a year, and again, the only academic Canon Law journal in the United States. What kind of work does that involve in terms of inviting, selecting, reviewing articles to be included in each issue?
It requires a lot of trust and patience, because the submission of scholarly canonical manuscripts is not super abundant. I think just about any editor can tell you. So yeah, I do receive manuscripts from people from all over Christendom, writing in English, and so we have a peer review process, a double-blind peer review process whenever those do come, whereby the author doesn't know who's reviewing the work and the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. At least I try to make that happen. And I do also solicit articles from individuals. It's something I want to be better at, especially designing whole issues. Certain journals are really excellent at doing that. They'll design a whole issue around a certain theme. So I'm going to be working on doing more of that. But I do approach individuals, inviting them to write an article on a certain theme, but everybody is busy, so it's not always something I can count on. I also am very interested in publishing jurisprudence from both the Apostolic Signatura and the Roman Rota, and we've been doing that for over 10 years. It was initiated, it seems to me, by my predecessor, Professor Kurt Martens, who started receiving decrees and sentences from the Signatura, having them translated and publishing them together with a commentary. So I've continued that really excellent idea of his. We've included also now recent decisions of the Roman Rota. Roman Rota publishes its jurisprudence, but they tend to be about 10 years behind, just because it takes a long time to assemble these volumes. So I think 2017 is the most recent volume of Rodal decisions, but we've published them within a year or 2 years from when they were actually published to the parties. And that's the initiative of the Rota, being very sharing of their decisions.
Now, in your own experience, what would you say have been the more significant developments of canon law in general? What things have definitely improved? What areas are there where there's still uncertainty or confusion? Are there any specific reforms you'd like to see brought about?
I am not an expert in penal law, but I do think the revision of Book 6 by Pope Francis, really begun by his predecessor, of course, through the Dicastery for Legislative Texts, is an excellent and very encouraging development. Especially, we don't want people to be punished. We don't want any of us to sin, but it does happen. And the promotion of the coercive aspect of ecclesiastical governance is invaluable, at least for the rulers of the church to know that and to take it to heart. Part of that has been also encouraging to me, the encouragement of just decision-making. Whether that happens in the individual case always remains to be seen. It's based on the diligence of the individual superior, but you do have in Book 6 now the clear emphasis on the necessity of achieving moral certainty before imposing or declaring a punishment, and a re-emphasis on the right of defense of the accused. So those are very positive developments in Book 6 itself. The revision of Canon 1671 to 1691 on causes of matrimonial nullity, I think, still contains a number of doubts within it, just in the drafting of those canons. A number of canons that really beg for clarification. Not that clarifications are absent, but one has to go searching in more recent Rodal jurisprudence. One has to go searching in responses of the Dicastery for Legislative Texts for clarity. And so the law, I think, has some inherent shadows within it, which I think is really unfortunate. So in a future revision, probably of the whole code, I don't know if and when that would happen, I do hope that several of those points could be clarified.
And looking to the future, what do you think are the prospects in terms of continuing to provide good canonical training to those who will be involved in marriage tribunals and in other diocesan roles requiring an accurate knowledge of the law?
Looking at our own students, I'm very hopeful that the administration of justice in tribunals is becoming increasingly serious. They do take to heart how the extent to which canon law is at the service of the church, the service of souls, how it is a critical part of the mission of the church. And I think it is only this that can really capture the attention of our students. What is the role of canon law in the order of salvation? If we don't have that, it becomes a lifeless discipline. So I think a continuous emphasis of that. There are the basic canon law studies, especially at the second cycle of canon law studies, by which one achieves a licentiate, earns a licentiate degree. But so important, as with all areas of professional and ecclesiastical life, the ongoing formation of canonists is indispensable. And in this regard, I see a lot of hope. We have here the Canon Law Society of America, You have the Canon Law Society as well of Great Britain and Ireland, and the annual conferences are such an important setting for growth in knowledge and also mutual encouragement. Other smaller conferences too, I think, are very rich in their offerings. We have one in La Crosse, Wisconsin every summer, which I invite all listeners to consider coming to, at the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Just a 2-day conference, day and a half even, for canon lawyers and civil lawyers. And it's a very spiritually rich and enriching event, as well as intellectually stimulating. I know the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, Santa Croce in Rome, also has these ongoing formation courses, basically 3 or 4-day conferences. And these also are really important supplements to the studies. This is, in a sense, the licentiate is an introduction to canon law, a total introduction, but it's the ongoing study that really makes one, a real iuris peritus, a real expert in the discipline.
Well, thank you, Dr. Daniel. We can finish on that optimistic note. And thanks once again for all your contribution to the world of canon law. I know you've written many other articles especially on procedure and so on. May your work continue to flourish at the Catholic University of America, and perhaps some people may be inspired from hearing you to offer articles for the Jurist or to contribute in some way to the world of canon law. So thanks once again, and I hope to speak again before too long.
Thank you for your encouragement and the kind invitation.
Thank you again to my guest today, Dr. William Daniel, and to my producer, Charlie Brown. And thank you to Emma Settiardi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. And if you have any questions, comments, or even suggestions of guests for future episodes, then please do contact the show on canonicallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So until the next time, goodbye and God bless.